the premier event in cycling is the Tour de France. And I say France because that's what they say. That's what they say. I'm not going to say Tour de France. I'm going to say France because, I'm a journalist. And he when sort of he won his first, they started introducing the fact that he was doping. And what he was doing is what they call EPO, which is EPO, which is essentially, I believe, more red blood cells in your body. And it gives you sort of a 10% edge, as they said, but they really did a really good job of explaining the math of having 10% over 21 days can be the difference between winning and coming in last place. And the doping that he was doing was not necessarily being tested or tracked, but did you ever think while watching this, sort of like the same way that when we watch Olympic sprinters, there's always a kind of like, maybe not, I'm not sure. Like when you learned about all of the success and the Tour de France wins and the times, did you sort of view the sport of cycling as one that could be tainted with scandal the way that we viewed baseball at one point, and the way that we viewed other sports at one point, like track?
I didn't, because I wasn't intimately involved and I didn't understand, the intricacies of what it took to be competitive, what it took to be great. What about the recovery? You're riding for so many days, all of the things you need to overcome, just the muscle memory of it. They get injuries as well and that type of thing. But I have a hard line stance as somebody that was fortunate enough to basically, beside my brain, my athleticism put me in a position to do everything that I'm able to do in my life. And I'm so very fortunate. I don't respect cheaters in sports. I just want to make sure we're on the same page. So if you're taking steroids in baseball, basketball, or whatever, if you doping or you doing whatever, I don't have any respect for you, because that's a conscious decision. And once you start making that decision, you have to continue to compound it time and time again. So it's not like a mistake. To me, a mistake is you're driving, you spill coffee on your shirt, not doping, not taking steroids. So players that did it in baseball don't belong in the Hall of Fame. Lance Armstrong, for example, and all of these cyclists that talked about how they got introduced to doping and so very young, and I know that everybody was doing it type of thing, that doesn't make it any better for me.
Yeah, I mean, they painted it in the documentary as you either were doping or you were not in the competition. Like it was almost like it wasn't an excuse, but it was just how they explained the culture of the sport was you were either doping or you weren't on the team. And that's not fair to the riders that were clean throughout their career, because their careers were much shorter than those that were doping. And one thing that I want to make sure that we touch on is his bout with testicular cancer. And I think that they do a good job in this evening's documentary of explaining just that the awareness was so much lower at that time. I think that since the 90s, we're now 20, 25 years separated, that there's so much more awareness about this particular type of cancer and how prevalent it is and how to check for it. But Lance obviously let it go unchecked for quite some time and ended up being diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, which is such an important part of this narrative. And I know that next week when we get part 2, we'll sort of see the complete disastrous downside of what happens when he was truly caught with doping and it was a public thing. But you have to remember, before that happened, and sort of like at the end of the documentary, he's kind of like at the peak of his prowess. He was not just a cancer survivor. He was a cancer survivor and absolute thriver. And before we get to the thriving, one thing I want to talk to you about, which I thought was really interesting this evening, is he was asked if he felt the doping led to testicular cancer. And he sort of calmly explained that he cannot answer yes or no to that. But he did note that the year before he had testicular cancer was the only year they ever used HGH, or human growth hormone. And he went on to sort of slyly explain that if human growth hormone grows the good things, can't it also grow the bad things as well? And watching this documentary, Jalen, do you see a causality, like a true link between his use of sort of performance-enhancing drugs and his diagnosis for testicular cancer?
I believe so. And if that's not the case, that's kind of how the timeline was portrayed in the documentary. It makes you feel like, based on his doping and the things that he was putting into his body, that then led to him getting testicular cancer. And I recall that happening real time, and him still being a successful rider, raising so many dollars for cancer. And for awareness and things of that nature. That's why Jacoby, and you alluded to it earlier, his number with the government was so high. $100 million.
Yeah.
$100 million.
The U.S. Postal Service was essentially saying that the entire time that he was receiving money for them and sort of like being a brand associated with them, that he was essentially a fraud. So they felt like that value was $100 million. And they actually have a pretty good case. I mean, I can understand that, but it wasn't just the U.S. Postal Service that was benefiting from his doping. It was cycling itself. And at the end of this evening's documentary, they did a good job explaining the chaos that was the scandal that was the 98 Tour de France. And then in 99, when Lance comes back, all of a sudden he's back from cancer after a very short amount of time. And look at him. He's the leader. He's not just competing. He's leading. He's got the yellow jersey on. And at one point he tested positive for cortisone. And there's a lot of people that suspected him of using performance enhancing drugs, but he tested positive for cortisone, which he clearly was using as a performance enhancing drug. But he explained it away as saying, you know what? I used that as a pain reliever for the saddle sores I was getting during racing. And the head of the cycling basically turned a blind eye to that. Do you think there was sort of an institutional blind eye turn to his performance enhancing use that was helpful for the sport, helpful for the money, helpful for the bottom line that allowed it to happen?
So this is the line of demarcation that it gets acknowledged, but I don't think it gets covered the way it should. When we see universities come to mind that have sexual scandals with coaches and or trainers like Penn State, Michigan State, and my beloved University of Michigan.
And many more.
And many more. I believe that his taking cortisone while he knew it was something that he should not be taking. But it goes back to what I was saying. When you're flagrantly cheating David Jacoby, you have to be willing, to hope that it puts me in position to be great. But then you also have to understand that the side effects can be deadly or painful. And that's not just physically to your body and testicular cancer and all of that stuff, but that's also emotionally, your reputation and those type of things if it gets discovered. And I just always felt like that wasn't worth it. And so as I watched this doc, to be honest, I'm like the people at the beginning of the doc. I would have been in a restaurant saying what they were saying.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.